President Bush has ordered new sanctions to be placed on the Sudanese government for its role in the violence in Darfur. Last week's announcement blocks 31 companies tied to the Sudanese government for using the U.S. banking system. The sanctions were seen as a victory for the Save Darfur coalition, a U.S. group leading a vocal campaign pressuring the White House to take action. But the New York Times reported Saturday some of Save Darfur's public efforts have angered aid groups working on the ground in Sudan. The aid groups say Save Darfur's call for imposing a no-flight zone could lead to a halt in aid flights and put their workers at risk. Aid groups have also criticized Save Darfur for not spending its multi-million-dollar budget on aid to Darfur's refugees. Mahmoud Mamdani is one of the world's most prominent Africa scholars. Earlier this year, he wrote a major piece for the London Review of Books called The Politics of Naming: Genocide, Civil War, Insurgency. He was born in Uganda and now splits his time between Uganda and New York, where he is a professor at Columbia University. Mahmoud Mamdani stopped by our Firehouse studio Friday. I began by asking him about the name of his article, The Politics of Naming.
I think the larger question is the names, genocide in particular, come into being against a background of the 20th century and mass slaughter of the 20th century, and particularly the Holocaust. And against that background, Lemkin convinced that the international community, and particularly states in the international community, have an obligation to intervene when there is genocide. He is successful in getting the international community to adopt a resolution on this. Then follows the politics around genocide. And the politics around genocide is when is the slaughter of civilians a genocide or not? Which particular slaughter is going to be named genocide and which one is not going to be named genocide? So if you look at the last 10 years and take some examples of mass slaughter, for example, the mass slaughter in Iraq, which is in terms of numbers at least no less than what is going on in Sudan, or the mass slaughter in Congo, which in terms of numbers is probably 10 times what has been happening in Darfur. But none of these have been named as genocide. Only the slaughter in Darfur has been named as genocide. So there is obviously a politics around this naming, and that's the politics that I was interested in.
And what do you think? What do you think this politics is?
Well, I think that what's happening is that genocide is being instrumentalized by the biggest power on the earth today, which is the United States. It is being instrumentalized in a way that mass slaughters which implicate its adversaries are being named as genocide, and those which implicate its friends or its proxies are not being named as genocide. And that is not what Lemkin had in mind.
The simplifying of the conflict by the U.S. media, you write extensively about this, who the sides are.
Well, I was struck by the fact, because I live 9 months in New York and 3 months in Kampala, and every morning I open the New York Times, and I read about sort of violence against civilians, atrocities against civilians, and there are two places that I read about. One is Iraq and the other is Darfur, sort of constantly, day after day and week after week. And I'm struck by the fact that the largest political movement against mass violence on U.S. campuses is on Darfur and not on Iraq. And it puzzles me because most of these students, almost all of these students, are American citizens, and I had always thought that they should have greater responsibility, they should feel responsibility for mass violence which is a result of their own government's policies. And I asked myself, why not? I asked myself, how do they discuss mass violence in Iraq and options in Iraq? And they discuss it by asking, agonizing over what would happen if American troops withdrew from Iraq. Would there be more violence, less violence? But there is no such agonizing over Darfur, because Darfur is a place without history. Darfur is a place without politics. Darfur is simply a dot on the map. It is simply a place, a site where perpetrator confronts victim, and the perpetrator is named as Arab and the victim is named as African, and it is easy to demonize. It is easy to hold a moral position which is emptied of its political content. This bothered me, and so I wrote about it. Let's begin with the numbers of the dead. Okay. The only group in a position to estimate how many people have died in Darfur is UNICEF, because UNICEF is the only one that did a comprehensive survey in 2005 in Darfur. Everybody else only knows the piece of ground on which they work and will then extrapolate from it, like any other NGO, like Oxfam or Médecins Sans Frontières or World Food Programme. The WFP estimate was 200,000. Out of these 200,000, the WFP report tells you that roughly about 20% died of actually being killed, of violence. And 80% died mainly from starvation and from diseases. And normally in our understanding of genocide, we put both those together and look at them as a result of the violence, because the violence prevents the medicine going in, etc. Except in the case of Darfur, it's not a single cause situation. Darfur is also the place which has been hit hard by global warming. The UN Commission which sat on global warming very recently spoke of Darfur as the first major crisis of global warming. In other words, from the late 1970s, you have had a significant desertification, and you've been having in the north of Darfur basically a situation where people simply, entire livelihoods are destroyed, and which has been one of the elements because it has driven the nomadic population in the north down into the south. So how many people are dying from desertification? How many people are dying from the violence that has been unleashed through this civil war in Darfur? Second element in this is that there's a civil war going on in Darfur. There are two rebel movements, and both rebel movements were born in the aftermath of the peace in the south. And those who were unwilling to accept the peace in the south, who thought the peace in the south should have included a resolution for all of Sudan, particularly for Darfur, and not simply for the south, they were the inspiration behind the two movements that developed. One movement, the Sudan Liberation Army, was a movement strongly connected with the SPLA in the south, especially with those sections of the SPLA who were not happy with the partial nature of the settlement in the south. And the other movement, the
SPLA is?
The SPLA, sorry, is the Sudan People's Liberation Army, which had organized and led the guerrilla war in the south for several decades under John Garang. The second movement was the Justice and Equality movement. The Justice and Equality movement, unlike the SLA, which is a secular movement, Justice and Equality is an Islamist movement. And it was a break-off from the regime in the Sudan. It was a break-off between two sections of the regime, the military and the civilian section, and particularly the section led by the chief ideologue Hassan Turabi, who split from the military wing and was the inspiration behind the formation of the Justice and Equality movement. So you have, in a way, a very strong Islamist rebel movement, and you have a strong secular rebel movement, and these two began their operations in 2003. The government's response, and I saw the ambassador's response there, which was as disingenuous as Bush's response, in a sense, because he's claiming that it's just a civil war inside. The government has nothing to do with it. It's not true. The government's response was to pick a proxy and arm it. And the government was in a way smart enough to pick those who were the worst victims of the desertification and the drought. It picked the poorest of the nomads from the north, whose livelihoods had been entirely destroyed and who had simply no survival strategy at hand, and gave them weapons. And these guys went down south, and their object was not to kill the peasants in the south, but to drive them off their land. The government's response was also to pick a second group, and that second group are the nomads from Chad who have come into Darfur. And to understand that, one has to look at the third dimension of the conflict, which is that over the last 25, 30 years, there's been a civil war going on in Chad. Chad, during the Cold War, was a bone of contention, first and foremost between the US and France. and both had their allies in the region. France allied with Libya, the U.S. allied with the military dictatorship in Sudan, with the Numeri dictatorship in Sudan. And every oppositional movement in Chad had a base in Darfur. And they armed themselves, organized themselves in Darfur. So Darfur was awash with weapons for 2 decades.